John Walter, son of Louis and Margaret Walter, born in 1863. John L. Walter, the oldest child of Louis and Margaret Walter, was the family leader throughout his adult life. He married Anna Mary Bauer, November 18, 1890, and they had 5 children. He was involved in everything that had anything to do with Lanesville, Indiana. Learning the carpentry trade from his father, Louis, John organized his brothers to create the Walter Brothers Construction Company. Construction was not John's only interest. He helped form the Lanesville Mutual Aid Society. He served as one of the directors of the society for many years. The society paid the final expenses of deceased members. It was, in short, a form of life insurance company. John also started and managed a funeral home. When telephone service came to Lanesville in the early 1900s, John was chosen to install the telephone poles. When Lanesville opened their first bank, John was chosen to be one of the directors. John's generosity and reputation for honesty was known throughout Harrison County. When someone lost their business or job, John managed to find them work. A local merchant, John Geiss, whose business failed, found employment with John building houses and barns in the Lanesville area. John seemed to have time for everyone and everything. He was very involved in St. Mary's Church, and besides donating money, he was involved in every aspect, the physical maintenance of church property. He was often written about in the Corydon Democrat newspaper, and when both he and his wife Anna died, their deaths were front-page news. His popular daughter, Frida, often mentioned in the newspaper's coverage of social activities, never married but remained the devoted daughter of her parents and lived with them until their deaths. John continued to work and be productive in his old age. He was still building houses and barns until his late 80s. He was an amazing man. Corydon Democrat newspaper. Obituary for Mrs. Anna M. Walter. On front page of newspaper. Mrs. Anna M. Walter, wife of John L. Walter, passed away Sunday night at 11 o'clock at her home in Lanesville. Mrs. Walter has been ill the past 4.5 months. Mrs. Walter was born July 28, 1865, and was 79 years, 8 months, and 20 days of age. She was the daughter of the late Adam and Eva Bauer of Posey Township. She was a member of the Catholic Church and highly esteemed by her many friends. Requiem Mass held this Wednesday morning at 8:30 o'clock at St. Mary's Catholic Church, conducted by the Reverend Father Clement Hunger. Interment was in the church cemetery. Survivors are her husband, John L. Walter, 3 sons and 2 daughters, Octave Walter of New Albany, Herman and Joseph Walter, Miss Frida Walter, and Mrs. Martha Walker of Lanesville. She also leaves 3 sisters, Mrs. Eva Ditenger and Mrs. Frieden Ebel of Louisville, and Mrs. Mary Ralston of Newark. 5 sisters and 4 brothers preceded her in death. Corydon Democrat newspaper. Obituary for John L. Walter. On front page of newspaper. John L. Walter, 90, highly respected citizen of Franklin Township, died Tuesday morning at 6:45 o'clock at his home in Lanesville. Mr. Walter had been ill for several months. A funeral director and building contractor for many years, he retired in 1929. Mr. Walter was an expert carpenter and continued to work at the trade even in recent years at the age of 87, and older. He was a son of the late Louis and Margaret Huzard Walter. He spent all his life in the community in which he died. Mr. Walter was a member of St. Mary's Catholic Church and Knights of Columbus. The remains were brought to the Gelbach and Roy's funeral home and later removed to his home. Requiem Mass will be held Thursday morning at 8:30 o'clock at St. Mary's Catholic Church, conducted by the Reverend Albert Lays. Burial will be in the church cemetery. Surviving are 3 sons and 2 daughters, Herman Walter, near Georgetown, Joseph Walter, Miss Frida Walter, and Mrs. Martha Walker of Lanesville, and Jerry Walter of New Albany. He also leaves 17 grandchildren and 3 brothers, Frank and George Walter of New Albany, and Conrad Walter of Louisville. Adeline Walter, daughter of Louis and Margaret Walter, born in 1867. Addie, was the devoted daughter of her mother and father and beloved sister of her 6 brothers. She was the only daughter in the Louis and Margaret Houssard-Walter family. She never married but counted her nieces and nephews as her own. Addie was the devoted daughter who took care of her father, Louis, in his final years. This was no easy task since Louis was suffering from dementia. In her advanced years she still canned food from her garden. She visited her brothers' homes and was Aunt Addie to the next 2 generations of Walter children. Obituary from New Albany Tribune of August 10, 1947. Miss Addie Walter dies at home of brother. Funeral services for Miss Addie J. Walter, 79, of 527 East Elm, who died at 6 p.m. Friday at the home of brother, Frank Walter, 1912 DePauw, will be held at 9 a.m. Monday at St. Mary's Catholic Church. Burial will be in St. Mary's Cemetery. The body is at Kraft Funeral Home pending the last rites. Surviving are 3 older brothers, John Walter, Lanesville, Conrad Walter, Louisville, and George Walter, New Albany. Frank Walter, son of Louis and Margaret Walter, born in 1869. Frank and his wife, Clara, had suffered heartbreaks with the early deaths of 2 of their children. Their son, Raymond, died in 1908 at the age of 5. They suffered another great loss when their daughter, Irene, died at the age of 20 in 1918. She had married George DeLow in 1917. She died after giving birth to her daughter, Dorothy. George married again and Frank and Clara raised their granddaughter, Dorothy. New Albany Tribune obituary January 18, 1955. Frank J. Walter, 85, died at 1 o'clock Tuesday morning at his residence, 1912 DePauw Ave. He was a retired construction foreman and a member of St. Mary's Catholic Church. Surviving are a son, Arthur Walter, 2 daughters, Mrs. Robert Miller and Miss Julia Walter, all of New Albany, 3 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild. The body is at Kraft Funeral Home pending completion of arrangements. Edward R. Walter, son of Louis and Margaret Walter, born in 1872. According to the Corydon Democrat newspaper in 1900, Edward Walter was considered one of Lanesville's bright young men. It was also published that he was marrying one of Taylor Township's fair belles, Miss Amelia LaPlante. The 1900 federal census shows Conrad Walter living with them in New Albany, Indiana. This was shortly after their marriage. Conrad had obtained a construction job in New Albany, and in the tradition of the Walter family always helped each other. Edward tried to make a go of it in his beloved Lanesville and moved back. According to the federal census of 1910, he was still in Lanesville. Unfortunately, Lanesville was a small community that couldn't support the number of carpenters that his father, Louis Walter, produced. Every one of Louis's sons was a carpenter. Edward and most of his brothers eventually left Lanesville to obtain employment. Edward and his family ended up living in Cario, Illinois. In 1943, Edward lost his soulmate, Amelia. Edward didn't last much longer and died in 1946. Edward R. Walter obituary. Edward R. Walter, 73, of Mounds, died Sunday at 5:45 p.m. at the home of his daughter, Mrs. Catherine Webb, 422 9th Street, Cairo. He was a member of the Carpenters Local Union of Cairo. He leaves 4 daughters, Mrs. Marie Taylor of Mounds, Mrs. Edna Booker and Mrs. Agatha Alderd, both of Washington, D.C., and Mrs. Webb of Cairo, 1 son, James of Chicago, 1 sister, Miss Addie Walter of New Albany, Indiana, 4 brothers, Frank and George, both of New Albany, Indiana, John of Lanesville, Indiana, Conrad of Louisville, Kentucky, 15 grandchildren and other relatives. Friends may call this afternoon at Ryan Funeral Home in Mounds, where the body will remain until funeral service, which will be announced at a later date. Ryan Funeral Service is in charge of arrangements. George A. Walter, son of Louis and Margaret Walter, born in 1876. George was a successful builder and banker in New Albany, Indiana in the early to mid-1900s. He and his wife Ernestine Wisman were best of friends with Severin Bachman and Matilda Wisman. They had a double wedding at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Lanesville, Indiana on September 11, 1900. Father Pexkamp officiated. This was the same year the Walter family built a new school for St. Mary's Church. George, along with his father, Louis, and brothers, did most of the construction work in the Lanesville area. When the Walters did construction work in the early 1900s, they did it all. They even made their own bricks by preparing and burning clay. George was a hard worker and conservative by nature. He wasn't one to waste money but instead invested it in his business. As a result, he achieved financial security, provided for his family's material and educational needs, and was an outstanding citizen in his community. Leo Christian Walter, son of Louis and Margaret Walter, born in 1881. Leo, like his brothers and father, was a carpenter. He probably met his future wife while working in Chicago. All the Walter siblings worked in places like Pittsburgh, Chicago, Milwaukee, Louisville, and the state of Kansas. Work was scarce in and around Lanesville, but there was a train station in nearby Corydon that provided the means for quick economical transportation to the larger metropolitan areas where work could be had. LaPorte, Indiana became home to Leo and Sadie. Leo's Lanesville family often visited, and it was often mentioned in the Corydon Democrat newspaper when Leo and his wife were visiting family in Lanesville. Conrad Walter, son of Louis and Margaret Walter, born in 1878. Conrad Walter was born December 25, 1878 at Lanesville, Indiana. He attended and graduated from St. Mary's Catholic School. He worked with his father and brothers building houses and barns in a 10-mile area around Lanesville. He attended a business college at Logansport, Indiana, but returned to the carpenter trade and worked in Gary, Indiana and Chicago, Illinois area for the Schmidt brothers, general contractors. During the construction of the Panama Canal, Conrad signed up for a 2-year work tour with free transportation. After battling mosquitoes and fever for a few months, he quit the job and paid his own transportation to Florida, where he worked for a while and bought some acreage close to Dade Park, Florida. Sometime in the early 1900s, Conrad returned home to New Albany, where his sister, Addie, and father Louis resided. He then went to Chicago, where he again worked for the Schmidt brothers, general contractors. Conrad and Catherine were married at St. Mary's Catholic Church on September 3, 1907. They made their home in Gary, Indiana, where he was employed as a carpenter and contractor. Due to the large number of foreigners coming to Gary to work in the steel mills, Conrad and Catherine decided to move to Chicago, where Conrad again worked for the Schmidt brothers as a carpenter foreman. In 1915, Conrad, Catherine, and family moved to Hillside, a community about 8 miles west of Chicago. Conrad wanted to leave Chicago and return to Florida, but Catherine didn't want to move that far away from her family in Lanesville. In May 1916, the car in which Conrad and 3 other passengers were riding to work was struck by a fast-moving train at Maywood, Illinois. The driver and 1 passenger were killed. Conrad was critically injured and not expected to live. The other passenger was slightly injured. Conrad was taken to Cook County Hospital in Chicago. He suffered a crushed left shoulder, internal injuries, fractured jaw, and broken ankle. After several months in the hospital, he recovered, but his left arm and leg were paralyzed for life. After Conrad's recovery, he returned to the Schmidt brothers, where he worked as a bookkeeper and job estimator. After further recovery, Conrad left the Schmidt brothers and opened a grocery store near his home in Hillside, Illinois. The business must not have been that good, because he quit the grocery business and moved his family back to Lanesville, Indiana, in the fall of 1919. The Conrad family moved in with Catherine's mother, Mary Tice, who lived about 5 miles north of Lanesville. About a year later, in 1920, the family moved to the Breckenridge community, about 4 miles west of Lanesville, where they engaged in a homemade candy business. In 1921, Conrad moved his family back to Lanesville, Indiana, where he and his brother George contracted to build the first high school in that community. This began a period of better times for the family. Conrad and George obtained many more building contracts in the Lanesville, New Albany area. In February 1924, Conrad bought a 29-acre farm behind St. Mary's Catholic Church in Lanesville. Everything was going fine for the family until the Great Depression started in 1929. These were desperate times for the Walter family and the nation as a whole. In the spring of 1931, Conrad moved the family to Louisville, Kentucky, where he bought the Manual Inn restaurant at 213 East Oak Street. Catherine Tice Walter died of cancer on May 18, 1938. Conrad Walter never remarried. He lived with his daughters, Helen and then Mary, in a house he purchased at 228 East Caldwell Street in Louisville, Kentucky. Conrad died January 27, 1955 from a blood clot that lodged in his heart. The Tice family and the Walter family were very much like blood relatives. Catherine Tice's mother, Mary Doherty Tice's parents were married in Ireland in 1848 and migrated to the United States in 1850. The federal 1860 census shows they were living in New Albany, Indiana. John Joseph Tice was the firstborn of Ferdinand and Mary Tice. He was born February 1, 1879 and died September 4, 1965 at the age of 86. In today's time we would say that John was mentally challenged. In John's time he was simply backwards. His family recognized early on John's limitations and provided a productive life environment for him. John was an excellent caregiver and would live for weeks or months with a family member that needed his help. He probably lived with all his relatives at one time or the other. In later years he would visit his nieces and nephews' families and was a big hit with their children. Children just naturally took to John. It was like he was one of them. John lived a simple life of taking care of his extended family by being there when they needed him. Of course John needed his extended family as much as they needed him. Catherine Tice was born on December 13, 1880 in Louisville, Kentucky. She was the daughter of Ferdinand M. and Mary Doherty Tice, who are buried at St. Mary's Cemetery in Lanesville, Indiana. Her family moved near Lanesville when she was a small child. She attended public neighborhood schools during the winter months and St. Mary's Catholic School when the weather was better in the spring and fall. She had to walk 3.5 miles from her home to attend St. Mary's School. After completing her education, Catherine worked as a seamstress and then as a clerk in a delicatessen in New Albany, Indiana. The Tice family and the Conrad Walter family were as deeply connected as if both families were blood relations. They took care of each other in hard times and helped each other in every way possible. There was not enough work in the small town of Lanesville to support all the descendants of the third generation. Joe Tice went to Chicago to find work and was successful. Conrad and his brother George often went to Chicago in early 1900s and joined Joe in Chicago's lucrative labor market. Joseph Tice found his big opportunity in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He married Pearl Olson of Milwaukee in 1915. They had only 10 years together before Joe died at the age of 39. Joe was a true entrepreneur, and when he died he had acquired enough rental property to provide a lifetime income for his widow Pearl. Pearl never remarried but spent the rest of her life involved with her Walter and Tice families. Since she and Joe never had children, her nieces and nephews became the children she loved and spent time with. Mary and Helen Walter were especially close to her and would visit her for weeks at a time during the summer months. They would ride the train from Corydon to Milwaukee. One would be going to see their Aunt Pearl while the other was on her way back. Frank Tice. Like his brother, Joe, and his brother-in-laws, Frank became a carpenter and builder. He married Margaret O'Rourke in 1911 and they settled down in the Cincinnati area in Ohio. Frank was a real go-getter and started his own contracting company. It would appear that he was very successful. During the Great Depression, he and his family lived in a solid middle-class neighborhood of the time. Frank and his brother-in-law, Conrad Walter, took turns keeping Frank's brother, John. Frank and Conrad were close and stayed in contact over the years. Frank and Margaret had 4 children. Mary Naomi, who lived from 1913 to 1997, Raymond, who lived from 1915 to 1972, Viola, who lived from 1918 to 1995, and Claire Pearl, who lived from 1921 to the year 2000. This concludes part 2 of the Walter family of Lanesville.